A 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, hello.
Hello, this is Ian Clarke of the Serious Rock Talk podcast. I'm speaking today with Jim Berkenstadt, author of the best-selling book, The Beatle Who Vanished, reissued this year and updated to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' 1964 World Tour. Jim, welcome to the Serious Rock Talk podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Ian.
Oh, it's wonderful. For about 2 weeks, Jimmie Nicol replaced an ailing Ringo Starr on that 64 tour. Folks, if you're like me, you've probably heard the name Jimmie Nicol, and that is about it. This is the first historical account of this little-known drummer who journeyed from humble beginnings to an incredible height. However, that was only part of his legend. Though his 13 days of fame made headlines, the true mystery of his account includes blacklisting, we'll get to that, drugs, divorce, bankruptcy, and an eventual disappearance that leads many to question whether he is dead or alive. All the elements, I would say, of a compelling drama. Jim, first off, let me say that I have read hundreds of books about rock music and performers and pop culture, and I can place your book on the top shelf. It's a fantastic read.
Oh, wow, Ian, that's so nice. I'm honored. It was the real work,
Yeah.
A lot of effort, but a very interesting story, and, I like the mystery aspect to it as well. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. To quote from the book, you write, "I never realized there was an entire musician's biography and mystery wrapped up in one person." Given the richness of this story as a narrative, as music history, as a kind of psychological study, were you surprised that no one up to the point that you put a pen to paper, so to speak, had written a comprehensive story about Jimmie Nicol? What flipped the switch?
Yeah, I think that I was surprised that no one had ever looked into him because, most people in America, just had barely any knowledge of him at all. I think because I've been a Beatle historian, worked for George Harrison, worked for the Beatles company, Apple, all that sort of thing.
Sure.
I maybe know a little bit more than, say, the average American about the group, but I always thought, how come there's only one sentence in history books about him? I looked even at general music history books, and there was just nothing. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to use my research skills, try to find people that knew him, and really that's what helped. Was one person would lead me to the next person. At the end of the interview, I'd say, "Is there anyone else I should talk to?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, here's so and so." So I was very fortunate.
It was a great bibliography. Yeah, I mean, you did an amazing amount of research.
Yeah, I sort of fall down the rabbit hole whenever I write a book, and I just want to find out everything I can, and then I also want to verify it and make sure that I'm not reporting something that didn't happen.
Well, like all outstanding books, I think, fiction, nonfiction, this book operates on more than a few levels, and I thought it would be enlightening if we lead our listeners through just 3 of those levels, with detours, of course, along the way. And I was thinking about, his personality, the pop music world of the 50s, 60s London, and your role in this as a kind of rock and roll detective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, for the personality, early on in the book you write, Jimmie was unconventional from the start. He did not conform to the norm. He was known as a sincere lad, but one happy to be a contrarian. Jim, as you did your research, were you surprised about what we could call the early Jimmie Nicol? Did you have any expectations going in?
Well, again, I did start at the beginning of his life and career when I started researching. But one of the things that struck me right away was how serious he became about his drumming very early in his life as a young boy, and how hard he worked at it. Because I was unaware that he learned so many different styles of drumming. He played in big bands. He played in ska, which is an early form of what people know as reggae.
Sure.
He did rhythm and blues with Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, rock and roll as well. So those are all, and even jazz, and those are all different types of drumming styles. Usually we think of a drummer as just, being great at one style of drumming, and they just stick to it. But he really wanted to branch out, and he was into learning. He wanted to know everything he could about being a drummer. He even worked as a drum repair guy at Boozy Box. Yeah.
As I went through his story, it seemed to me that many of the decisions that he made, which were detrimental to his drumming career, had about them the so-called contrarian feel. Often it seemed to me like he was a loner in a very communal profession. And in reference to the Beatles, you quote him as saying, "I couldn't take it after a while with all the rules." What did you think he wanted? Money or respect and artistic integrity? It's often hard to decipher his decisions.
I think he wanted artistic integrity and respect, but on his own terms. He was really a very independent person, even though he married several times, even though, like you were saying, he had a very communal career. When you play in bands and such, all these band members become friends of yours and such. He just really wanted to do things his own way, and you're right that when he came back from the Beatles, he really should have gone back to session work. He would have ended up playing with Jimmy Page, who later started Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, that was a great bit you wrote. My eyes popped out when I read that.
I know, and then he also should have kept playing at night with Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. They completely exploded and then got to tour America. All that happened shortly after he got back from the Beatles. But instead, he decided to start his own group and sort of try to compete against the Beatles. And the problem with that was, number one, if you're a drummer sitting in the back and you're not singing, who's going to be impressed with your band? Remember when Kurt Cobain died in Nirvana, Dave Grohl didn't continue to sit in the back somewhere. He wanted to start his own group, which he did, the Foo Fighters, but he moved up front, the lead singer and guitarist. He couldn't have done that sitting in the back, which is something Jimmy didn't understand. And so Jimmy hired all these buddies that did session work, and they couldn't be there for a long time because they could make much more money as session players.
Right.
And as the gigs got smaller and smaller, as the newspaper headlines faded away on the fifth Beatle, Jimmie Nicol, he really could not afford to keep these guys in his band. And also, he lost a record deal with Pi, so there was no money coming in that way. He wasn't getting radio airplay, smaller gigs, etc. So it just collapsed, and it's a shame because even then he maybe had the opportunity to go back and mend his burned bridges, but he forged ahead with another band, and the same result happened, and he ended up divorced and bankrupt and kind of at a loss for a while.
Well, part of it, when I was reading his story, as you portray it, it's almost as though he's such a good drummer, he gets somewhat bored with rock, the 4/4 beat, and he takes drugs to kind of cover that up. And I wonder if that somehow influenced his decisions, that he kind of hit the ceiling a little too fast.
Well, I agree with you that he did become bored. Like, he was a full member when he disappeared, and I later found that he had secretly started up a new career, a secret life in Sweden, with the pop group called the Spotniks.
Oh, yeah.
He was visiting countries around the world. He was a musician. He would help produce and, of course, play the drums and such. And at some point, like 2 years in, he did start to get bored. And he did, I think, because they had a long period in Mexico, he was exposed where they were in a hotel every night. He was exposed to, kind of the drug underworld there, and that came from just even associating with other artists.
Right.
And, I just think that, sometimes we get a little too far over on our skis.
Yeah.
And I think that happened again. What's interesting, though, is no matter when something did not work out for Jimmy, of course, we know that he vanished each time, but more importantly, he always picked himself up. He always did things on his own terms, and he would then, find success again. So at least that's impressive, that he never gave up. He never compromised on his own sort of personal rules, and he always seemed to bounce back.
Yeah, he is incredible that way. When you think of all the downturns he had, off he goes again.
Mm-hmm.
He's just...
Yeah.
And
It's amazing.
He's an amazing guy for that. And I was wondering, kind of an overarching question with his personality, if he had not performed with the Beatles for 13 days, what kind of guy would he have turned out to be? I think you partially answered it by saying he would have just stuck with Georgie Fame or whoever else was going around at that time, and perhaps even been just as happy or more happy.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think that that's probably what he would have done. I think ultimately he would have formed his own band and maybe even taken some of he had known some of the other players in Georgie Fame, the Blue Flames, from past bands.
Right.
In fact, he even knew, he was one of those drummers that played on a lot of early tours organized by Larry Parnes, who's thought to be the first pop rock promoter in England.
Oh, sure. What a character Larry Parnes was. Wow.
I know. And so Jimmy really knew all those people in all those bands, because they would all travel together on these tours. And so he easily could have formed his own band. And I think the key is when he did form his own bands after the Beatles, the vocalist, who was a very nice guy, but he wasn't he didn't have a unique voice. He wasn't that exciting. And,
right.
And I think that if Jimmy had found himself a great vocalist, then he could have, run his own successful pop band from the back row in the drum kit area there. But
do you think when you were writing this, and you mentioned it a few times, you kind of quote him or indicate what he was thinking. Do you think that he seriously considered that he could replace Ringo Starr?
I think he was starting to get that vibe because of the people I interviewed who were around him then. For example, the drummer for Sounds Incorporated, a group that was also with Brian Epstein that toured with them down under. And that drummer indicated that it seemed like Jimmy was getting along great with the Beatles as social friends. The Beatles' old buddy Tony Sheridan from Hamburg was on a flight with them, and Jimmy had already known Tony Sheridan before the Beatles, so there's a lot of bonding and a lot of common elements there. But I don't know. I just think that he thought, like, hey, maybe if Ringo doesn't come back for a while, they'll just, replace him with me. Because if you think about it, 2 years earlier, Ringo had replaced Pete Best. However, I think the thing that Jimmie Nicol didn't understand was that the Beatles were like four brothers at that point.
You're
so
right.
even if they thought Jimmie Nicol was a slightly better drummer or something than Ringo Starr, they weren't going to replace Ringo because he was like their fourth brother.
Yeah,
So
I agree with it.
realized that.
You made a great point. It was only 2 years in. We look at it now, 60 years later.
Mhm.
But for him, it was just 2 years. So, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
So when I read them, I thought,
People,
like, is this guy delusional? And I thought, no, it's just less than 2 years. What have you? And Ringo was.
yeah, I think he was very confident rather than delusional.
You're right.
I think he just thought, hey, I'm getting along with them. I played some really good shows. Maybe there's a chance I can be the next Beatles drummer, and if not, then, so be it.
Wow. Now, by many accounts, Jimmy also thought that Brian Epstein frustrated his later career. I can't understand why Epstein, he's a busy guy, would interfere with his career. What do you make of that?
Well, yeah, Jimmy, it's important to kind of go back in time when Jimmy was with Vince Eager in the Quiet Three in like 1960, 61. Vince Eager, the lead singer, butted heads with Larry Parnes.
Okay.
And Jimmy was there and saw how Larry Parnes actually did blacklist Vince when Vince said, "I'm not going to work for you anymore." And Vince couldn't get a singing job for 2-3 years because of it. So Jimmy saw that firsthand, so that was clearly in his mind. Then when Jimmy was on his last full day with the Beatles in Melbourne,
Right.
they had a press conference with 5 Beatles, and Jimmy was sort of the fifth man left out, and they were all focused on the Fab Four, and especially Ringo returning. And Jimmy made the mistake of sneaking off to the side to a reporter while, of course, he had a live mic. And that disrupted the rest of the press conference. There's video of this out there, probably on YouTube. And it's interesting because you can see Derek Taylor, the publicist, is getting very annoyed. And but then, again, the drummer for Sounds Incorporated was there, and he said, "Oh, man," he said, "Epstein just blew a gasket because he just felt that this was just so impolite
Yeah.
to do that,
Right.
and just selfish." So when the press conference ended, Brian blew up at him and said, "Just go back to your room and pack, and we'll take you to the airport tomorrow." So that happened, and then Jimmy packed, but then he went off to a pub.
I know.
And then Epstein's like, "Where's this guy? We told him to stay in his room." And so he sent like Mal and Neil Aspinall out to get him. And I remember, because I worked with Neil Aspinall, I said, "Well, what was that like?" He goes, "Well, it was funny because we found Jimmy in this pub and said, 'What are you doing?' He's like, 'Well, I'm not a Beatle anymore. I'm just having a drink.'" And Neil was basically saying what Brian Epstein told him to say, which was, "Well, you are a Beatle until we put you on that plane." And obviously Epstein was always concerned with image, He didn't want the Beatles to get caught out in trouble somewhere. And so Jimmy was not used to that sort of controlling management because he managed himself. And he felt that was really rude. And so he got it in his head that Epstein just didn't like him and was probably going to blacklist him like Larry Parnes had done to Vince Eager. So,
Okay.
he got on the plane and he went back home, and it wasn't until I interviewed his second wife, Julia Villaseñor, in Mexico that it really came true. She said he took that gold watch that Epstein and the Beatles had given him, and he slammed it into a drawer, and it broke into a million pieces, and all that was left was the sort of gold watch back with the engraving from the Beatles. And she said he was just so mad because he felt that Epstein was still ruining his life. And ironically, he continued to feel that way even after Epstein died at the age of 27. So, I
know.
I'm no psychiatrist or therapist, but I do think that at some point Jimmy may have started to have some mental health issues.
Yeah, that was my feeling too. Yeah.
It's just a vibe I got from researching and talking to people around him.
Yeah, I picked that up too. He's functional, but there's background noise going on,
Yeah, and in fact, one of the other Beatle handlers, I think, I'm trying to remember, it wasn't Tony Barrow, it was another one of them, but he said, I asked him directly, I said, after, Jimmy came back, did Brian Epstein blacklist him? And he said, absolutely not. He said, first of all, Epstein never blacklisted anybody. And second of all, even though they had that little bit of a tiff on the last day, Epstein was very aware that Jimmy saved the tour, the world tour, saved the Beatles' reputation, saved lawsuits, all types of things, because he did a good job and performed well. So he said, look at even a couple weeks after the Beatles got back,
right.
Epstein went out of his way to put Jimmy and his band, the Shub Dubs, on the bill with the Beatles. So he said he wouldn't have done that if he was blacklisting him.
I know. So that's what I thought too. It doesn't really fit, but
doesn't add up.
Doesn't add up. Okay, we're going to take a look at the pop music environment that helped make Jimmie Nicol who he was. You speak a lot about it in the book. Certain places at certain times in history offer wonderful expressions of art. It might be Paris in the 20s or San Francisco in the 60s. In the late 50s and early 60s in London, it was a very colorful time. Rock music manager Larry Parnes, whom we've already mentioned, I think deserves a book himself. I'm sure there's one out there. This was a London that was about to swing, and Jimmy was a young man when he hit the streets and the cafes. Jim, how do you think London shaped Jimmy at this time as a person and as a drummer?
That's a great question, Ian.
Thank you.
I think that a lot of young men, for the first time, their generation didn't have to go off to a world war.
Right.
And so they had more free time. And while many of them just maybe went into factories to work, others, it just seemed like it was an artistic time. Others wanted to do things like painting or making music. And skiffle really contributed a lot in England because you didn't really need complete instruments, maybe one acoustic guitar, and then
you're right.
The bass was made out of a broomstick into an upside down bucket, with some clothes or strings or something. So it was very simplistic. Oh, and washboard with a ring or a pick.
Yeah.
So people were getting into all these bands and playing and enjoying it. And then in London, which is where Jimmy was growing up, these two guys, I think one was like a wrestler and another guy was just some sort of promoter, got together and started the Two Eyes, which was a coffee club in London.
Okay.
And it boasted of, like the fanciest coffee machines in the world. And these kids would go to this club like maybe 9, 10 o'clock at night and then pound all this coffee, which of course kept them up all night. And soon they realized, hey, we got space in the basement. Let's put a stage in there, maybe get some music, and maybe we can charge admission and maybe a club membership, and we can get some young kids in there to play, but also keep the kids happy who are drinking coffee all night.
Right.
And it really caught on, and a lot of famous people played the Two Eyes when they were nobody, and ultimately ended up being the first pop stars in England. And so that's the area where Jimmy was working at Boozy and Hawks as a drum repairer, hoping to find some places to go where he could play. And that connection by having these, musicians who were maybe a little bit further along come in, that sort of networking helped him get over to the Two Eyes where he would be able to sit in occasionally. And once people heard how great he was, then it was time to put Jimmy in a band.
It's when I read about it, at that whole scene, it struck me there's kind of a like a frontier spirit to it. It was very entrepreneurial, as if they didn't know how long it was going to last. I remember there's that famous quote from Ringo Starr. I think somebody asked him, what do you plan to do when the Beatles break up? And he said, open a hair salon or something. And I thought...
Right. I think you regrets that.
Yeah, I remember I'm hearing that, and I thought, poor Ringo. You don't know where it's at, because nobody does. And then you wrote about, what was it, the Discount Top 6 cover EPs, where Jimmie Nicol would play Beatle covers, and I thought, talk about irony. When you consider, it's just incredible. You can't make that up. And then he gets in the Beatles.
Yeah, the fact that the stars aligned for the Beatles and for Jimmy, they needed someone right away in less than 24 hours to start a world tour and to get on a plane.
Right.
And here comes this guy, the third person they chose, because the first two turned them down, drummers. And he knows all their songs as soon as he walks into EMI Studios to play the set list, because they were the same ones that he had recorded earlier in the year as covers.
Right.
What are the chances that they find a guy that knows Ringo's parts? It's incredible.
It's just
story.
That you can't make that up. And when I read that, I thought, Destiny's Child, this guy's incredible. And then, maybe it didn't turn out so great in some ways, but wow, what a lead-in that was,
Oh, I know. I think the thing that fascinates me about writing non-fiction music books is that sometimes the truth is much stranger than a fictional novel, and more interesting.
Oh yeah, if you wrote that in fiction, they would say, "Oh, come on, you better try harder than that."
I think you're right.
You know what I mean? Don't tell me he rehearsed Beatles songs on a knockoff EP. By the way, some of those I bought in Canada. God help me. It was such a disappointment to hear them and think, "Oh God, this is not the Beatles." Anyway.
Oh, I know. Well, something for your listeners. I put up a playlist that goes along with Jimmy's recordings that are listed in the book. And the playlist is called Jimmie Nicol, JIMMIENICOL, The Beatle Who Vanished. And you can listen to about 15 songs that he played on, including some of those Beatle covers. And I just think it's fascinating when you're reading a book. You don't have to go out and try to find a bunch of old 45s. You can just create a playlist, and people can just listen along after they read about it.
Is this on your website? Where can they find this?
No, it's on the Spotify site. Yeah, Spotify.
Now, the final area we can look at, I was thinking, is your role as a so-called rock and roll detective. You talk about trying to meet Jimmy. You write, I first started to wonder why Jimmie Nicol was chosen to replace Ringo Starr in the Beatles, and why we had never heard anything about him before or after the Beatles. Now, Jim, given the obvious difficulties, what drove you to seek a personal interview with Jimmie Nicol?
That's a great question. To be very honest, that never had crossed my mind. And one day, I was sitting with a friend named Roy in town here. We were, our wives and us, we were all together just chatting. And he said, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I was telling him about this book. And he said, "Well, you can't end the book unless you go and try and knock on his door." And I said, "Are you crazy?" And he goes, "No, you should." He said, "If you go to London, not only can you see all the places that you're writing about, as he was coming up, as this rising drummer. But you can then find out before you go where he lives and knock on the door, and maybe he'll chat with you. And I'm like, oh, that's not a bad idea. I said, but rather than surprise him, I said, I'll send him a letter first and tell him that when I'm going to be there, and that I'm hoping to knock on his door, just so he's not shocked. And the other thing is, I called Vince Eager, who had played with Jimmy, and he told me that Jimmy had been back in London, and he was able to track down Jimmy's apartment. And so I picked up the trail, and I think it was in 2005, I visited London, and I went to Abbey Road, where he tried out the Beatles. I went to what used to be Pie Studios, what used to be Decca, where Brian Epstein first noticed Jimmy playing, and some other places. And then I finally got up the courage to, one of the last days, to go into Camden, which is a northern area of London, and walk down this. It was such a hidden apartment. You had to walk down an alley and get to the very end of the alley, and there was this apartment.
Right.
And I knocked on the door, and unfortunately, he wasn't there. Some young man was there holding a baby, and he had never heard of Jimmie Nicol. So I was kind of confused. And so I called up a detective in London that afternoon, and he did some digging, and he said, oh, Jimmy owns a 100-year lease on that apartment, and he hired some management company to lease it out, but we don't know where Jimmy is, but we know he's not in England anymore. And I said, well, how do you know that? And he said, because we happened to notice, which I think means hacked into the government computer system.
Yeah.
We happened to notice that his retirement pension is sent out of the country every month.
Okay.
I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So then the trail went cold again, but it was so much fun. I went to, these places I went to, Amsterdam, Sydney, Adelaide, Melbourne, and Mexico City, over the course of 10 years were trips that, our family was going to go on anyway.
Yeah, right.
So I just used those trips to disappear for one day in each place and, do the required research that I need to do. Melbourne was the gold mine because the entire file of the Australian promoter was there, and I couldn't take copies, I couldn't take pictures or anything, but they would allow me to read everything and take notes. So for 12 hours I sat at a desk in this room looking through every single letter between him and Brian Epstein. It was all correspondence.
Oh, wow.
We take email for granted, and even then, long-distance phone calls were far too expensive to use to plan the trip. It was all postal, all mail.
So these were original letters from Epstein. That's fantastic. That's great.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was great, and then original letters from the promoter as well. Oh, and then when I was done, I was thanking the woman that ran the archives, and I said, you look about the age where you might have been a young girl in Melbourne at the time. Did you happen to see the Beatles? And she said, oh yeah. She said, I went to a very strict Catholic school, and I called myself in as my mom and said that I was, said that our daughter is sick, and I went out to the big crowd of 300,000 people,
right,
all looking up at the Beatles when they were on the rooftop of this hotel in Melbourne, waving to the fans. I said, oh, that's cool. And I said, did you notice Jimmie Nicol? And she goes, oh, we just thought whoever was up there was Ringo, and we didn't know anything about Jimmie Nicol. And I said, well, that's okay. She goes, well, I had a lot of fun, but what I didn't know was the camera up on the roof panned down to the crowd, and I was the only blonde out of all these dark-haired girls, and he zoomed right in on me, and the nuns saw me, and she said they called a full assembly the next day and chained me up on the stage.
Oh, man.
I said, wow, that's quite a story. Can I put it in the book? And she said, only if you change my name. And I said, well, don't you think the nuns are all dead by now?
Yeah,
Because
really.
I'm still terrified of the nuns. So change my name, which I did.
Well, I'm sure it was worth it for her. Good for her, you know.
Yeah, I'm glad she got it.
Yeah, that's a great. I was thinking about Nicol too. It's like you got near the end of the book. You were talking about at one point he becomes a building contractor, and I thought, how would you so seriously reject this incredible aptitude for drumming, like to become a building contractor? I know he might have been a little disturbed in his thoughts, and he had to make money, but there's no correlation.
Yeah.
So it's like Keith Moon becoming a building contractor. Like you'd say, I'm not sure I'm following this. Do you think it was just some kind of rejection of his musical past, saying, I'm just going to move on?
I don't think so, because even while he was doing that, he did attend one Beatle convention in Amsterdam, and he talked about how he still writes his own music, and also a paparazzi guy told me that when he took a couple pictures of Jimmie Nicol in 2005, that he saw inside the house and saw a drum kit set up and saw sheet music, things like that. So I think he didn't. It's not that he gave it up. I just think that he decided, well, maybe I can make more money as a building contractor. And I guess that was one of the things that he learned as a young man, probably from his dad, I imagine.
Okay, that explains. I was just wondering.
Handy with the hammer.
Well,
Yeah.
in the first, and I guess the original epilogue of the book, you wrote, and it's a beautiful bit of writing, you wrote, Nichols is now part of an extinct era, the rockin' 50s and the swingin' 60s that lives on only in the memories of aging baby boomers and yellowed teen magazines, dusty old 45 records, and in the black and white flickering of old British Pathé newsreels. These relics and the memories of a select few survivors are the only remaining artifacts of a fascinating and creative, yet perplexing musical career. Jim, what for you is the most perplexing aspect, do you think, of Jimmie Nicol's life and career?
I guess I'm perplexed, and I mentioned this earlier, I'm perplexed that he did not go back to session work, which was, at the time, if you were lucky enough to be an artist called to sessions, 5 days a week, you made 3 times the average salary of a British adult at that time.
Wow.
Triple. So that surprised me. I think it surprised me, too, that he, again, left Georgie fame and the Blue Flame to start his own band. But I guess, that's where ego comes in.
Right.
You've been with the Beatles. You see yourself in the paper every day. They're calling you the fifth Beatle. Everybody on the street is, shaking your hand, or girls are screaming after you. And you don't realize that media, even if you're, even if you're some pop star in 2005, nowadays no one will even recognize you on the streets anymore. Eventually all that fades away.
Yeah, it does.
So I'm just surprised that he didn't want to stick with something that was more secure, and maybe, through working with Georgie fame, that might have led to another opportunity. And like, I said in the epilogue, that the updated part of the book, which is about 100 pages of things, that I interviewed this gal whose husband was in charge of scheduling all these guys for sessions, and she's the one that brought up the Jimmy Page aspect, and how they would have tried to do the same thing for Jimmy Nicol as they did for Jimmy Page, because they felt that these guys were two of the most talented people they had going to session work and wanted them to develop into their own careers later on. So it is perplexing that he didn't choose that route, but like I said, I think ego may have led him to just jump into creating his own band and trying to compete. What's interesting about that music that he did with Jimmie Nicol and the Shub Dubs and the sound of Jimmie Nicol in 1965, where those bands were kind of ahead of their time because it was sort of a jazz rock fusion, a lot of those songs. And that wasn't popular on the charts or on the radio at that time, but later in the late 60s, you had groups like Blood, Sweat, and Tears and others that were popular doing that, but perhaps ahead of his time there.
Wow, as I said, it's a fantastic read, and I hope we gave our listeners some idea of the breadth of this book. And I could understand, maybe it's a Shakespearean tragedy, more like a Greek tragedy. Somebody fell from a great height. I'm not sure what it is, but it's so compelling. So I want to thank you for your time today, and I appreciate it. And I've been speaking with Jim Berkenstadt, author of the bestseller, The Beatle Who Vanished, a book that I highly recommend. The book is available from Amazon and other sources, which we will post on our website. And again, I'd like to thank you, Jim, for your time, expertise, talking about Jimmie Nicol, a most perplexing man indeed.
Well, thank you so much, Ian. It's been a real pleasure being on your show.
Good.
And I have to say, these are the most interesting questions I've ever been asked about the book. You really delved into it, and a lot of questions I get are usually pretty superficial, but you really hit home with sort of the psychological aspects of this, as well as the mysterious part and the fun of playing with the Beatles and all that. Very interesting questions.